I grew up in a densely forested rural area in central Virginia, and like most kids my age, 10, at the time of this story, I spent a lot of time playing in and around the woods. My best friend and I had found a creek one day while exploring different deer trails through the woods. This creek we happened on was a very rare find and the perfect spot for us to play. It was wide and deep enough to swim around in and had nice, soft, mossy banks on either side to rest on after we had tired ourselves out. The water was cool and clear, no copperheads and no mosquitoes because the water was constantly running. We were psyched. After a few hours of swimming, we had to walk back home for lunch, but made plans to pack lunch the next day so we could have a picnic on the creek banks and spend the whole day there. The next morning we set out for the woods at around 1 p.m, planning to have the picnic first and swim after. We entered at the same spot we had the previous day and followed what we thought was the same deer trail. It was not. At the point where we should have found the creek, we walked into a small clearing that was covered in huge thick ferns. We had definitely never walked past this before. So, being both hungry and tired of walking, we decided to eat in the clearing. We laughed and played around there for a while, spitting watermelon seeds at each other from our lunch. It was an absolute blast, and we were both in wonderful, giddy moods. That all changed, however, as soon as we packed up and set back out to find the creek. As we walked on, the woods started to feel darker and colder. We got skittish, and I noticed my friend kept whipping her head around to look behind us. After about a half hour of walking, we came up on what looked like an entire overgrown bathroom. Sink, toilet, and bathtub, all sitting arranged together and covered in ivy. It's pretty common to find weird shit like this in the middle of the woods, so we just walked on and made jokes to lighten the mood, calling it Bigfoot's bathroom. After another hour of walking and not seeing anything we recognized, we started to panic. Instead of trying to reach the creek, we were now just trying to find our way back home, or out of the woods, at least. I told her we should follow the sun, and eventually we would come up on a road or someone's property where we could find help. She insisted on another way, and we began yelling at each other out of fear and, let's be honest, little girl bossiness. I told her if she thought she was so right, she should just go her way and we would see who got out first, so we split up. Now, as an adult, I fully acknowledge I was being a stubborn brat and also an idiot. Worst possible thing we could have done. Not 10 minutes after splitting up, I began to hear someone walking maybe 100 feet behind me. Thinking it was my friend deciding to go my way after all, I slow down so she can catch up to me. Instead, whatever it was matched my pace. I slow down, it slows down. I stop, it stops. This went on for hours. The whole time I was going back and forth on whether or not it was in my head or there was really something following me. I picked up a big stick, swung it a few times to make sure it was sturdy if I had to hit someone, and trucked on. As it began to get dark, I came up on something that made my heart sink into my stomach. It was Bigfoot's bathroom. I had just walked in a huge circle for hours, despite being 100% sure I was following the setting sun west the entire time. Confused and frustrated, I sat down on a log and just screamed my little heart out while smacking my whoop-ass stick repeatedly into the ground. As I tried to collect myself, I heard the footsteps again, walking up on me from behind. I called out my friend's name as loud as I could, no answer. Then, after a short pause, the steps began to run towards me. I jumped up and booked it fast as I could in the opposite direction. Now, this is the truly horrifying part which I typically omit while telling people this story. As I was sprinting through the darkening woods, I began to hear what I thought were church bells. I looked up to see the darkest, deepest cloud I have even seen in my life. In the middle, it was so black, it was like looking into the night sky, and the dark grey around it seemed to be swirling. It gave me a horrible feeling to look at, almost like the nausea you get when looking through binoculars too long. What sickened me further is that I realized the sound of the bells was coming through the hole in the cloud. They were deafeningly loud. I mean, really booming out of this thing. When I realized this, I stopped dead in my tracks. I felt a sense of absolute and overwhelming dread that has gone unmatched in all my 24 years on this planet. Something in my head began screaming that if I did not run away from whatever the hell that cloud was, no one would ever see me again. I would be gone. I did not want to run toward the thing chasing behind me either though, so I made a sharp right and took off away from both. It was now completely dark, and I was running blind through the woods, smacking through branches, wheezing, and tripping every few feet for what seemed like another hour, until I smacked into something low and flew over it, hitting the ground so hard all the air in my lungs was knocked out of me. As I lay there trying to recover, I realized I couldn't hear the bells anymore. Then my eyes adjusted more to the dark, and I realized what had just made me go ass over teeth was an old fence. Grabbing hold of it, I prayed it would lead me to a farm, and sure enough it did. I walked up over a hill about a mile to the back of the farmhouse, explained what had happened, and the farmer graciously gave me a ride back home. I was covered head to toe in scrapes, oozing blood, and more exhausted than I had ever been in my life. But I was finally safe. It was past 9 p.m. when I finally walked through my front door. My friend had gotten back shortly after we split and figured I had as well, so hadn't told anybody I was lost, and my family just figured I was still out after dark, which wasn't uncommon for me. They were shocked when I walked in beat up and crying. Nobody had been looking for me at all. To this day, I wonder how long they would have waited to come find me if I hadn't been lucky enough to find the fence, and if it would have been too late. This all went down in Kenilworth, Queensland, Australia, in the forest. My dad grew up on a forestry in Queensland, Australia, as the son of a forest ranger. My whole life we've spent a lot of time out in that forest, camping and driving through parts of the forestry that only rangers would travel, and only occasionally. One place that Dad loved to take us was a little farm in the middle of the pines that was impossible to find if you didn't know the way. Locals knew the place as Spike's Hut. Spike was a local farmer who had lived there for decades up until the 92nds, and had a reputation for being abrasive, violent, bigoted, and not concerned with the laws of men. He had a habit of approaching guys in bars who were wearing earrings and tearing them straight out, and there were a few stories about people who displeased him disappearing. Basically, Spike was not a nice guy, and his farm and hut reflected that pretty well. Dad would take us out there every time we visited the forestry to camp, and the hut would be more and more dilapidated. But the vibe was always the same, that straight-up feeling of being watched, even though Spike was long gone. As I got older, I became more aware of the signs of life in the place when we went to visit. There would be 44-gallon drums full of smashed beer bottles, fire pits with reasonably fresh coals. Someone was definitely out there. God knows why, since the place was literally a snake pit at that point. But Dad didn't seem concerned. One trip when I was a teenager got strange real quick. My friends and I were all piled into my dad's 4x4, and we were driving through the bush to Spike's, so Dad could tell his scary Spike stories and freak us out. We drove onto the property, and something immediately caught my eye. Up on the hill, opposite Spike's hut, there was what appeared to be a cowboy, slumped against a log, hat over his face, taking a nap. Something about his body position looked unnatural and uncomfortable. It wasn't the way you'd be sat if you were taking a casual nap in the middle of a workday, and even if it was, there was no reason for anyone to be out there. The farm was long defunct, and there was no forest business to be taken care of on the property. I pointed it out to my dad, and instead of letting us out of the car at Spike's, as he usually did, he said he wanted to keep driving through the farm to show us something. He maintained that it was nothing but that if the figure was still there when we came back through, we'd stop and check it out. Of course, whatever he wanted to show us seemed totally made up, as he just drove us through the forest a bit. And when we came back, I spotted the slumped-over cowboy again, never having moved an inch, still in that same unnatural position. I yelled out to Dad to stop, reminding him of his promise, but instead he acted like he couldn't hear me, locked the truck doors, and drove off the farm much faster than he ever drove on those dirt back roads. My friends and I all looked at each other in confusion, but we knew that when it came to this area, questioning my dad was futile at best, dangerous at worst. Dad denied that any of the events of that day ever happened after that. But my friends and I were still curious AF about what was going on out there. So a few months later, we went camping on our own and set out to find Spike's hut. It took hours of driving through the forest to find the gate to Spike's property, but eventually we found it without Dad's help. Something was off once we got there, more so than usual that day though. My mates jumped out of the car but were suddenly frozen, not wanting to walk any closer to the hut, for no visible reason. The vibe was just wrong that day, and it felt like we had walked into something that didn't belong to us. The tug in my gut to get out was strong, but I'd spent 2 hours finding the place and I was gonna explore it, god damn it. One of my friends acted brave and walked from the car to the hut with me, quietly acknowledging more and more signs of inhabitants with knowing nods between us. We said nothing to the others, but we were on high alert. It felt like someone could be back any minute, or that they had never left and were watching us as we poked around the debris. We walked up to the side of the hut to find a kind of small shed with 3 walls. I heard my friend's voice go squeaky as he called me over to look inside. On the ground was a huge pile of ashes from what looked like a cooking fire, and confirming this was the presence of a giant makeshift grill made from cross-hatched wire sitting over the fire, hinged to the shed wall. As I'm looking at this setup, I figure that whoever has been here has been hunting and cooking large chunks of their kill over the fire. Pretty clever actually, but then my stomach dropped. As my eyes travelled down from the grill to the ground, I saw a baby's sock, tiny, pink, and terribly out of place. Then another, then a shirt, then a ribbon from a child's hair, all sitting right beside the ashes on the ground, next to a Women's Weekly Christmas cookbook. That's when the alarm bells in my head went off, and I rounded up my mates to GTFO. Some ranger or crazy old bushie hanging out at that trashed hut was one thing, but there was absolutely no reason for a baby to be out there. And there's no way anything good had come of having a child's clothes right by a huge fire and grill. When we got back to the campground, we couldn't shake the rotten feeling of being watched, and all of us were so unsettled that we packed up our shit and decided not to stay the night. When I got home, I told my dad about it, and he just shook it off, saying weird stuff happens out there. Not exactly proper backcountry, but there is this place in Essie, Alaska called Dye, and it's kind of tucked away in this small bay. It's a tidal flat located near the start of the Chilkoot Trail, so it backs up against these rugged coastal mountains and thick northwestern forest to the north, and there's a ghost town. There is a river on one side, and the ocean on the southern side, and these towering mountains all around. The area had once been a hastily built little town to outfit the prospectors going over the pass on foot, but when they built the train into Skagway, the town was torn down and moved a few miles down the coast and reassembled. All that's left is one false front, the dirt roads, and a bunch of pits in the ground where the houses used to be. Farther south, out on the tidal flats, a bunch of trees were cut down when the town was thrown up, but have started to regrow over the past 100 years. So there are all these little stands of short and fat Sitka spruce, which are really pointy. The trees don't tower overhead and block the light. You can lose someone really easily though if they go ahead through a stand of trees. They're that thick. That also means you can be mere feet away from a bear and not know it. Our naughty husky used a network of fat tree stands to evade us for 30 minutes one time. The farther south you go, the more it thins out into native grasses. North, the trees get thicker and taller. That's where the town is, in the thick older forest. The mountains also come straight down to the ocean to create this closed-in effect. The whole place has kind of a mournful, isolated feeling because you know so many people died, horrible deaths going up the Chilkoot Pass, just above you. I grew up exploring ghost towns up and down the west coast and Colorado with my grandfather because both he and his father had been prospectors, and he loved to go back and visit those places. So Daiei was right up my alley. Anyway, the first time I was thoroughly creeped out. We were camping nearby, and I was just walking my dogs through the ghost town one last time before bed. Even before I got out of the car, I felt like something was wrong. I knew the heightened feeling of a bear or predator close by. This was different. This was looming dread. But I had this idiot instinct to translate fear into bravery and do it anyway. So I got out and started walking into the forest, and the feeling got stronger and stronger. The dogs were timid and hesitant. There was strong wind too, which just made it worse. Whatever was giving off this vibe seemed new to the dogs, or they were much more weary of it. I felt followed, watched, stalked, just very unsafe. I got turned around because I was scared and was not paying attention and ended up getting lost. I felt like I was deep in the woods now and panicked. Bad, I know. I wanted to get out immediately and had no desire to be brave anymore. Now the feeling was imminent danger. I had goosebumps and I felt sick to my stomach. I decided to just head in a straight line until I hit the river or the marsh, and then I'd just follow that back. I needed to head north to get back to the truck, so I hightailed it in a straight line through the bush, and suddenly came out on the tidal flats. I'd gone south, in the opposite direction. I was devastated. Now I had to go back through the Deathwoods to get out. But the feeling of dread had subsided a little though, and at least I knew where I was. I remembered there was the network of dirt roads on the flats I could use to navigate my way out. I had to carefully thread my way through the thick, pointy spruce to get to the main road. Now I'm worried about bears, but I would trade that for whatever was back in the forest. At least I could see overhead, use the mountains as a reference point to find my way back to the road. I found the road and started heading back. I had no idea what that was back in the trees, but I had zero intentions of ever going back to find out. The road was fine and the dogs relaxed until it entered that thicker, darker forest again. Guess that feeling wasn't confined to the ghost town. Dogs nearly stopped walking and fell behind me. Thank you, dogs. No White Fang, dog bravery here. I was so frightened, I just broke into a full-on sprint down the road until I got back to the truck. I remember shaking, and I started the engine and spinning gravel to get out of there. It wasn't a predator warning feeling, or that get out feeling people describe before a Sasquatch. It was a straight up, you're gonna die, we're gonna get you feeling. I felt hunted. When I got back to the state campground, my husband was surprised that I'd been gone so long, which is weird because I thought I'd come back early. Anyway, I downplayed the creepy part and just told him I'd gotten turned around. I kinda chalked it up to being late at night. Went back to the tidal flats a few times over the years, but never had that feeling driving through the forest. Until one time, maybe 3 years later, when my husband had gotten into photography and wanted to check out the cemetery, which was a little north of the ghost town. As soon as we turned onto the road, I felt smacked in the chest with that sense of looming dread. It was like the intention to stay in that part of the forest somehow summoned that feeling of malice. It was so strong that I refused to get out of the truck. I wanted out of there so badly, I was pushing against the back of the seat. My husband and son felt nothing. They knew I was not happy, but tolerating it, and didn't stay too long.